I still remember the creature's eyes, glowing in the darkness, fixed on me with predatory intent. Its reptilian form, covered in scales and spines, was illuminated by the dying light of my flare. The acrid smell of its breath filled my nostrils as it inched closer, backing me against the rocky outcrop. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat possibly my last. As the Chupacabra lunged, its razor-sharp claws extended towards my face, But let me back up. You're probably wondering how a skeptical biology student from the University of Texas ended up face-to-face with a creature I'd set out to prove didn't exist. It all started on Halloween night 2012, on the Texas-Mexico border. I'm Marcus Lee, and I was 26 years old when my understanding of the natural world was shattered forever. Have you ever been so certain about something that you'd stake your reputation on it? I used to think I knew where the line between fact and fiction was drawn. Now, I'm not so sure. The events of that night challenged everything I thought I knew about biology, evolution, and the very nature of reality itself. Like I said, it was October 31st, 2012. While most of my classmates were preparing for Halloween parties, I was packing my car for a research trip to the Texas-Mexico border. My goal? To debunk the recent surge of Chupacabra sightings once and for all. The timing wasn't lost on me. Halloween night in the middle of nowhere, searching for a mythical monster. If my colleagues could have seen me, they'd probably have joked that I was trick-or-treating for Bigfoot. As I drove south, the radio buzzed with news about the upcoming presidential election. Obama and Romney were neck and neck, but my mind was elsewhere. I was focused on the opportunity ahead, a chance to put an end to the ridiculous Chupacabra hysteria that had gripped the region. For weeks, local papers and radio stations had been reporting mysterious livestock deaths, animals found drained of blood, with strange puncture wounds. The locals were quick to blame the legendary Chupacabra, but I knew better. I was convinced it had to be something else, maybe bats or even hoaxers looking for attention. There was also the possibility of an unknown but perfectly natural predator in the area. Whatever it was, I was determined to find out and put an end to the superstitious nonsense. The sun was setting as I arrived at my research site, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. I could hear distant sounds of Halloween festivities from a nearby town, a stark contrast to the eerie silence that enveloped my remote location. The warm breeze carried the scent of dust and desert vegetation as I began setting up my equipment. I meticulously arranged my gear, motion-activated cameras, infrared sensors, and tools for examining any carcasses I might find. As an afterthought, I tossed an old emergency flare into my pocket. I reasoned that you never know what might come in handy out there, though I doubted I'd need it. Each piece of technology represented a bridge between superstition and science, tools that could potentially expose the truth behind the Chupacabra myth. As I worked, I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and determination. I wondered what the night would reveal. As darkness fell, the stars emerged with unusual brightness, unpolluted by city lights. I started my preliminary survey, the quiet occasionally broken by the calls of nocturnal birds and the rustle of small mammals. It was during this initial observation that I encountered a group of local ranchers passing by my campsite. They eyed my equipment curiously, and one of them, an older man with a weathered face, approached me. I remember him warning me to be careful, saying that El Chupacabra had been active lately. I couldn't help but smile, my skepticism evident. I explained that I was actually there to investigate these sightings, believing there was a perfectly rational explanation for what had been happening to the livestock. The old rancher just shrugged, his expression a mix of resignation and knowing. He told me, "Suit yourself, but not to say I didn't warn you." As they walked away, I couldn't help but shake my head. El Chupacabra, the legendary goat sucker of Latin American folklore. It was exactly the kind of myth I hoped to debunk with hard scientific evidence. I was confident that by the end of this trip, I'd have a logical explanation for all the strange occurrences. The night deepened and I immersed myself in my work. I checked the first set of camera footage, noting typical wildlife activity. Everything seemed normal, almost disappointingly so. But then, as I reviewed the last few frames, something caught my eye. A strange shadow flitted across one frame, too quick to identify. I replayed the footage, but the shadow remained elusive. I remember muttering to myself that it was probably just a bat or a large moth, making a mental note to check for local bat species that might be responsible for the livestock attacks. But a nagging feeling persisted, a sense that something wasn't quite right. As midnight approached, I decided to check the perimeter of my research area one last time before turning in for the night. That's when I stumbled upon a sight that made my blood run cold. In a small clearing illuminated by my flashlight lay a group of livestock, dead. But it wasn't just the fact that they were dead that disturbed me. It was the state of their bodies. Each carcass was eerily drained of blood with distinct puncture wounds unlike anything I'd seen before. The wounds were too precise for a wild animal, too bizarre for any known predator. My scientific mind raced, trying to categorize this predation pattern but coming up empty. As I collected samples with trembling hands, the rancher's warnings about El Chupacabra echoed in my mind. No, I told myself, there had to be a rational explanation. This was just an unknown species, perhaps a new kind of predator that science hadn't cataloged yet. Or maybe it was an elaborate hoax designed to perpetuate the Chupacabra myth. That had to be it. But as I stood there surrounded by the eerie silence of the desert night, the dead animals at my feet, and the vast, star-filled sky above, a chilling thought crept into my mind. What if I was wrong? What if the thing I'd come to disprove was actually real? And that's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in this quiet desert night, a high-pitched shriek that was neither human nor any animal I recognized. It was close, too close. And it was at that moment I realized my debunking mission had just become something far more dangerous than I could have ever anticipated. What would you do if you found yourself face to face with something you've spent your entire academic career insisting couldn't exist? As I stood there, frozen in fear, I was about to find out. That blood-curdling shriek galvanized me into action. I sprinted back to my campsite, my heart pounding in my chest like a jackhammer. The quiet desert night now seemed alive with unseen threats. As I reached my makeshift lab, I fumbled with my equipment, determined to analyze the samples I'd collected. My hands shook as I prepared the slides, a far cry from my usual steady, methodical approach in the university labs. But as I powered up my laptop, things started to go wrong. The screen flickered erratically, data logs became corrupted, and the night vision cameras picked up nothing but static. I remember muttering to myself, pleading with the equipment to work, frustration mixing with my growing fear. I thought of my professors back at UT, imagining how they'd scoff at my current situation. I could almost hear them saying that Lee was out chasing monsters from fairy tales again. But this time, I wasn't chasing monsters from fairy tales. I was running from them. That's when I felt it, a prickle on the back of my neck like I was being watched. I spun around, peering into the darkness beyond my lantern's glow. Nothing. Yet the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing moment. I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on me, calculating. Hungry. I tried to focus on my work, to find a rational explanation for the dead livestock and the eerie shriek, but my scientific training seemed woefully inadequate in the face of what was unfolding. I thought of all the times I'd dismissed cryptozoology as pseudoscience, how I'd lectured my peers on the importance of empirical evidence. Now, faced with something inexplicable, I found myself desperately wishing for a logical explanation. As I struggled to make sense of my malfunctioning equipment, I noticed something odd on the ground. Strange tracks encircled my campsite, appearing out of nowhere and disappearing just as mysteriously. They weren't like any animal prints I'd ever seen, not in textbooks, not in the wild. My mind raced trying to categorize them. Not canine, not feline, not bovine. I wondered what kind of creature had made these. I reached for my phone to document the tracks, but to my dismay, it wouldn't turn on. Dead. No signal. No way to call for help. The isolation hit me like a physical blow. I was cut off from the world, alone with whatever was out there in the darkness. The vastness of the desert, which had seemed so full of scientific possibility earlier, now felt oppressive and threatening. Another shriek pierced the night closer this time. It was neither human nor any animal I recognized. The sound sent shivers down my spine and made my skin crawl. I'd always prided myself on my logical mind, my ability to remain calm under pressure, but in that moment primal fear took over. I realized I was no longer the debunker. I had become the subject of something I'd come to disprove. The situation was escalating beyond my control. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of there. I started throwing my equipment into my car, abandoning my research in favor of safety. My fingers trembled as I tried to fit the key into the ignition. I remember whispering, pleading with whatever scientific or cosmic forces might be listening, begging the car to start. The engine sputtered and died. I turned the key again and again, each failed attempt increasing my panic. I was trapped there, alone with whatever was lurking in the darkness. Sweat beaded on my forehead, my hand shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. What had started as a simple debunking mission was turning into a nightmare. As I contemplated my next move, a movement caught my eye. At the edge of my campsite, illuminated by the dying light of my lantern, stood a creature that defied explanation. It was reptilian in appearance, with a row of spines along its back, and eyes that seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. Our gazes locked for a moment that felt like an eternity. In that instant, everything I thought I knew about the natural world shattered. This was El Chupacabra, the creature I'd dismissed as mere legend, the very thing I'd come here to disprove. And it was very, very real. Its eyes held an intelligence that sent chills through me. This wasn't just an animal. It was something more, something that challenged every scientific principle I'd ever learned. The creature let out a bone-chilling screech and charged towards me. Adrenaline surged through my body as I abandoned my useless car and ran into the darkness. The sound of claws scraping against metal told me the Chupacabra was right behind me. I zigzagged through the scrubland, my clothes snagging on thorny bushes, my lungs burning with each breath. As I ran, I kept thinking to myself that this couldn't be happening. The line between fact and fiction was blurring with each step. I'd spent years studying biology, confidently dismissing cryptids and legendary creatures as products of imagination or misidentification. But nothing in my education had prepared me for this. I wondered how such a creature could exist. What did its presence mean for our understanding of life on Earth? As I ran, dodging cacti and leaping over rocks, a part of my mind was already thinking about how I'd document this encounter, how I'd present it to the scientific community. Old habits die hard, I guess. But I wondered if anyone would believe me. Or would this experience relegate me to the fringes of science, alongside those I'd once mocked for their belief in the supernatural? The chase was on, and I was painfully aware that I was no longer the skeptic, but the believer, and the prey. As I ran for my life, one question burned in my mind. If I survived this night, how would I ever look at the world the same way again? My lungs burned as I ran, the cool night air searing my throat with each desperate breath. The sound of the Chupacabra's pursuit was getting closer, its claws scraping against rocks and cacti. I found myself backed against a rocky outcrop, the creature's glowing eyes fixed on me with predatory intent. My mind raced, searching for anything I could use as a weapon or defense. Then I remembered, the emergency flare in my pocket. With trembling hands, I pulled it out. I fumbled with the cap, acutely aware of the Chupacabra's approach. Its reptilian features were now clearly visible in the moonlight, every scale and spine etched with terrifying clarity. I could smell its breath, a nauseating mix of copper and decay. My fingers finally found purchase on the flare's ignition mechanism. With a loud pop and a hiss, the flare burst to life. The sudden explosion of intense light and heat caught the creature off guard. It recoiled, shrieking in what I guessed was pain or frustration. The red glow of the flare cast eerie shadows across the landscape, transforming the familiar desert into an alien world. But I knew this reprieve wouldn't last long. The flare's light was already beginning to dim, and with it, my hope of survival. The Chupacabra, momentarily stunned, was regaining its composure. In those fleeting seconds, I made a desperate decision. I hurled the still-burning flare directly at the creature, aiming for its glowing eyes. Time seemed to slow as the flare arced through the air. It struck true, and the night exploded into chaos. The creature thrashed wildly, its screams echoing across the landscape. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran, harder and faster than I ever had in my life. I don't remember how long I ran or how I found my way back to civilization. The first rays of dawn were breaking when I stumbled into a small border town, disheveled and babbling about the creature I'd come to disprove. The locals looked at me with a mix of concern and knowing glances. I could tell they'd heard it all before. At the local clinic, as a doctor treated my cuts and bruises, I tried to make sense of what had happened. But the more I talked, the more I realized how insane it all sounded. The Chupacabra, the chase, the flare. It felt like a fever dream. I kept wondering if it had all really happened. Or had the isolation and the Halloween atmosphere played tricks on my mind? I, who had always insisted on empirical evidence, now found myself questioning my own experiences. Weeks later, back at the university, I stood before my peers presenting my findings, but as I spoke, I saw the skepticism in their eyes. The same skepticism I had worn so proudly before that fateful night. My recordings were distorted, the physical evidence I'd collected was inconclusive, and my own account sounded far-fetched even to my own ears. I remember one professor interrupting me, asking if I was really suggesting that I had encountered the very creature I had set out to disprove. He wanted to know where my evidence was. The irony was palpable. I faltered, realizing that the truth I'd experienced was slipping away, replaced by doubt and disbelief. I wondered how I could convince them when I was struggling to believe it myself. The Chupacabra had challenged not just my understanding of biology, but my very perception of reality and the nature of scientific inquiry. In the months and years that followed, my academic career took a nosedive. I became obsessed with proving what I'd seen, chasing every lead, every rumor of Chupacabra sightings. My peers distanced themselves, my research proposals were rejected, and eventually, I found myself on the fringes of the scientific community I once championed. But I couldn't let it go. The memory of those glowing eyes, the sound of that unearthly shriek, they haunted me. I'd wake up in cold sweats, the desert night replaying in my dreams. I pored over cryptozoology forums and followed up on every reported livestock killing that seemed out of the ordinary. My apartment walls became covered with maps, photos, and news clippings, a testament to my growing obsession. As I sit here now, older and perhaps not wiser, I'm left with questions that plague me daily. In a world where science can't explain everything, what do we do with the unexplainable? How do we reconcile what we know with what we experience? When the line between skeptic and believer, between observer and observed, has blurred beyond recognition. The Chupacabra is still out there, I'm sure of it. And one day, I'll find the proof. Until then, I'll keep searching, straddling the line between science and the unknown, knowing that sometimes the truth is stranger than any fiction we set out to debunk. But let me ask you this. If you were in my shoes that night, face to face with something you'd insisted couldn't exist, what would you do? Would you trust your eyes, your experience, or would you cling to the comfortable certainty of established science? Because in that moment, when the impossible becomes possible, you might find that the scariest thing isn't the monster in front of you. It's the shattering of everything you thought you knew about the world.